Okay, so this garbage was first published in 1979. V.C. Andrews's Flowers in the Attic. I first heard of this um, way back when, to be honest. I can't give you a specific time. I recall hearing about it in my early 20s, but I'm sure I'd heard of it before that as well. And in fairness to it, it was pretty big and still is in a lot of regards. It's been made into a movie twice, no less. One of them starring Heather Graham, which, I mean, given that I've already called it trash, I have to say that I would be intrigued to see the film just to know if they took any liberties with the plot, because I'd be very surprised if they didn't. So, what's it about? In case you aren't aware, it was mostly famous, and I will admit my interest in it was based on the fact that it was called the incest book quite a lot. That's what it was known for, infamously, or that's how it gained its notoriety. But in all fairness, I will get to that bit actually. But yeah, it does have more than that to it. Although I would argue that in terms of what's most memorable about it, it doesn't surprise me that that is the bit that's kind of cherry picked. So what's it about? It's told from the perspective of Kathy, and she is, at the time it starts, I don't know, 12-ish, something like that. She's quite young. And they've got this perfect family, the Ganger family, I think it's called, something like that. They got a weird name. And they go on about, Daddy's perfect. I mean, the first chapter is called Goodbye Daddy. So you kind of have an inkling as to where that's leading. But it basically depicts this like very well-to-do suburban family that everything's kind of going beautifully well. They've got a brother and sister who are either in their teens or nearing their pubescence. And then we've got some newborn twins, aptly a brother and sister. And everything's perfect with that. Blah, blah, blah. It's the dialogue, the prose is quite, how should I say this? Maybe an example would be good. Just random, page 11. There came a Sunday, Tuesday in May, when Daddy was home. For 2 weeks, Daddy had been hanging around home, waiting for those babies to show up. Mama seemed irritable, uncomfortable, and Mrs. Bertha Simpson was in our kitchen, preparing our meals, and looking at Christopher and me with a smirky face. She was our most dependable babysitter. She lived next door, and was always saying Mama and Daddy looked more like brother and sister than husband and wife. Bit of foreshadowing there. She was a grim, grouchy sort of person who seldom had anything nice to say about anybody, and she was cooking cabbage. I hated cabbage. Yeah, it's very easy to consume and kind of endearing from a very, it's so shit, it's good kind of perspective. So I can kind of go along with that. I did guess that as the story went on, or I hoped that a lot more would happen and it would get a bit grittier perhaps, which it kind of does, but only within the kind of theme and context of the piece. So they're living this ideal life, and then, oh no, Daddy's dead. There's a car crash, a vehicular accident. And yeah, that sucks for everyone. But then there's this kind of idea, let's say, from the mother, or she hears from her father, and she's invited back to her beginnings, basically. And she takes him up on the offer, even though she's been disowned pretty much by her family. So there's a little bit of kind of suspicion raised there. And in the middle of the night, she kind of like gets all her kids and she's like, all right, fuck this place. We can't afford anything. anyway. It's all going to get taken away. So take the things that you want with you and let's vamoose. So that seems a bit odd. And then she explains that because she married their father, she was basically disinherited. And you're kind of thinking, okay, that's a bit weird. I wonder why. And then they get to the house, and then before the kids know what's going on, they've been shoved into this room that's just below the attic. So it's on some floor. This is a mansion, by the way. It's huge. Like, it's one of those very typical vast estates in the middle of nowhere kind of thing. And they get locked in there, and it gets explained to them, oh, it's only going to be a few days and all of this. So you already have this notion. Of course, I had the prior knowledge of, like, this was a novel about kids getting locked up in an attic. So you kind of know everything you're reading it's not going to be true for the kids. They're going to be stuck inside of this kind of makeshift prison, as it were. And then there's another grandmother, or their real grandmother, really, and she plays a very typical, highly religious, fanatic and bitch. Basically, she's the archetype bitch, kind of like the typical grandmother out of any fairy tale, actually, where she claims that they're all sinners and they were born of the devil's issue, I think it was termed. And so the kids get more and more intrigued by why they're being kind of abandoned in this fashion. And then it turns out, I'm going to spoil this for you. So in case, if I haven't sold it to you by this point, I'm about to rant. So yeah, spoilers ahead. So what we find out is that the mother, Corinne, is actually the half niece of her late husband, who was her half uncle. And because of this incestuous relationship, she was shunned from the family. They got married, I suppose, in secret. And I think their real name is like Foxworth or something like that. And so, yeah, the name was changed into that Dollenganger weird name that they have at the beginning. And they have these kids. They're all born, like, they're fine, there's nothing wrong with them or anything like that. So we already get this inkling about some sort of incestuousness going on. And that, as was kind of alluded to in the the extract that I read, or the excerpt, yeah, it's kind of hinting like, oh, yeah, they didn't look like each other for no, good reason kind of thing. And so they get dumped into this room. And yeah, really, not a lot happens. They make do with what they've got. They get fed like the same types of food every single day, and they get also fed on a bunch of empty promises. The original premise is that the grandfather is, he's on death's door. So all the mother really wants to do is like gain back her inheritance money because he's rich beyond your imagination kind of thing. And yeah, so she's going to play the good daughter when she comes back without telling him that she's actually got 4 kids locked up in the room upstairs. So there's some obvious issues with the plot development. But in all fairness to it, the premise isn't that bad. I don't think it's like awful. I think it's an interesting one. It reminded me a little bit of the recent film Room with everyone's favourite actress. I'm going to forget her name now. Fuck. It's going to annoy me. I can't remember her name. But yeah, the one who's always like getting slagged off on YouTube. In fact, I will look it up quickly because that's just going to annoy me. Yeah, Brie Larson, that's the one. So it's kind of similar, but that film and I presume book is just dealt with in such a better way. If you remember in the film, we actually beginning medias res, and we're already inside the room. And so we kind of learn bit by bit what led the kid and her to be there. and who's keeping her captive and all of these types of things. It's actually a really good film and very well acted. But this isn't, and this isn't a good book really. It's kind of one of those reads that is so trashy that you can kind of indulge it just because it's funny to do so. I imagine it was probably like the 50 Shades of its time, almost, when I think around the kind of 80s, early 80s at least, there was a lot of these kind of, pulpy, over the top, nonsense types of works of fiction and also movies that were subsequently made from a lot of these books. But yeah, to get back to it, Kathy's obviously getting to this. One thing about the novel as well is that it's told from her perspective, but it's told from one where she doesn't seem to have aged or matured in any fashion whatsoever. Like, I couldn't really understand this about it, because I would presume that she is much older now that she's going back and retelling the story, and yet it still feels like it's being told by a kid. Someone who's about 12, 13, and it is in a world that never existed, I would say. Like, ooh, good golly gosh, and all this types of thing. Like, some of the dialogue is it's so bad. It is kind of delightful in how preposterous it really is. And yeah, that was just something I couldn't really get to grips with. I let it go as it went on, but I was a bit perplexed. I kept thinking, well, clearly they've survived this because she's telling the story. So I'm not really sure what that's supposed to entail. Like, does she continue to speak as if she's 12 or 13 in the following books in the very big series that it turned into? Which is also a sign that I predicted early on that the ending was going to suck, mainly because I knew that it was just going to keep going, and so I was hoping for a more conclusive ending that could be picked up into a sequel, but I didn't really feel that that's what I got overall. I really felt like it bent over for the opportunity of a sequel and was placating towards that quite a bit. But I'll get to that a bit later. So we're in the attic room. They get told they'll only be there for a few days. That's a lie. Her brother Christopher is about 14, I think, when they first joined, 15 maybe. He wants to be a doctor. He's obsessed with books. I mean, for all intents and purposes, they are quite decent kids. I'd give them that. And, they're kind of endearing, and the way they relate to one another is kind of sickeningly charming, I would say. Like, there's something about it that keeps you, like, intrigued. Like, I don't think they're badly thought out as characters. I think the ones surrounding them are, like the grandmother, the grandfather that you never really hear anything from. You see him briefly, but not really. And yeah, the kind of the maids and servants that are scattered about this mansion, but you never really hear from them until the plot needs you to. And so what they do to make do with their time is read. There is an attic that the grandmother is conveniently too scared to go in because she's somewhat agoraphobic or something like that. I can't remember what the fear is, but it's the confined space that leads up to the attic. She has this thing, and she's like a woman who's like the Iron Lady. She's scared of fucking nothing apart from this attic room, which is very convenient because obviously when we don't want her to enter that room, we've got the excuse as to why she doesn't. And there's quite a bit of that kind of thing where you can tell it's lazy writing, really. But I could buy into a few of those concepts. It's fine, I suppose. But yeah, it did read, the plot needs this, so I'm just going to shoehorn it in. And then, yeah, wash my hands of it, and then that's it. Though in fairness to Andrews, I don't think she did it so much as like loads of sick shit could go on inside the attic and then the grandmother's never going to know. It didn't really play with that. It was more like they use it as their kind of playground of fantasy. Flowers in the Attic is their kind of, because they make it into a garden, so it's almost like this, dare I say, attempt at being like a kind of Garden of Eden kind of esque fantastical land that they could escape in and still get a bit of sunlight. And occasionally they go out onto the roof and all these types of things where they delight in what could have been, I suppose, in terms of their fantasies and imaginations. And the flowers are just like little cutout paper mache types of things that they decorate. And yeah, they kind of indulge in all of this stuff at the beginning because, yeah, their secret garden, as it were, is a way for them to escape the horrors of their situation. Obviously, this doesn't last very long. About a year in, they're starting to get a bit tetchy with the situation. I think they took way too long to figure out that their own mother didn't really give a fuck about them. All she did was kind of shower them with gifts during her many, many, many outings out in the real world, where she got to wear jewelry and fine clothing and all this kind of stuff. And I kept thinking, this mother's arc is going to be weak. And yeah, that's all it really was in the end. I don't know whether Andrews had an issue with her own mother, but she does dedicate the piece to her in the beginning. But it's kind of funny that she does that because the mum in this is arguably the most villainous and atrocious character, I would say, abhorrent even, really, because everything she says is bullshit. And she makes promises that she, it turned out, knew she was never going to keep. And all she really cares is about herself. Like, she looks after number one at all costs, even at the costs of her children's lives, to be honest, which isn't really explained. I mean, apart from her background and things like that, we don't really get an inkling as to why she would behave like that, considering that her late husband and her had this, you know, ideal lifestyle and they'd managed to make good out of a really, you know, troubled upbringing, or at least a tumultuous one. And yet, when push comes to shove, the mum is the mother's worse than the grandmother, which is kind of a, you know, that's something to say, considering the grandmother often threatens them. She pours oil over Kathy's hair at one point because she saw her posing in the mirror, looking at her breasts and stuff like that, because she's developing. And I think Christopher was looking at her in that kind of curious way, shall we say, which does lead me on to the incest. Quite a few people I'd noted, at least from Goodreads, seem to go on about how that was unnecessary or it was gratuitous or whatever. I would actually say that it was quite downplayed. It only really occurs probably for about 3 to 5 pages of the whole piece, and that's a 400-page novel. There are linguistical insinuations throughout where you're kind of like, is that referring to something that it shouldn't? It seems a little licentious or even salacious at times, which I couldn't really. I think that was its intention, where it was a bit like, oh, the other sex and all this types of thing. So it was kind of like being, yeah, insinuating and full of innuendo, but never really getting to it until one passionate type of moment where Christopher kind of loses control and he just basically hurls himself at Kathy and somewhat forces himself on her, but she seems fine with that overall. Like, she understands it. She had this like inkling as well. Obviously, them being brother and sister, they know it was wrong, and they do. You know, it's not like they actually engage in a proper relationship or anything like that. But what I have to argue now against some of the reviews I read was that in this situation, incest would would occur. I didn't actually think it was, abnormal, really, like, as funny as that is to say. But given that they were both, close in terms of their age range, he being older, her being slightly younger, they're going into puberty. The only people they see are themselves, they're themselves and their younger, very young, they're kind of infant twins. The grandmother who only turns up to drop a picnic basket, and a mother who's increasingly sporadic in her visits. That's it. Those are the only people they ever see, apart from occasional bits where they get to go outside of the room for like a night or an evening or whatever. And to me, that all that really lent to is like, well, of course, that something is going to happen because their living conditions are so abnormal and they're being treated as if they're already freaks, essentially. Like they're unloved, and it seemed inevitable to me. And given, I kept thinking, why are the young twins in this? I didn't really understand that. And they're all called like names with the letter C. It's like Kathy, Christopher, Corey, and I forget the other fucking name. Might have to look it up. It's going to annoy me that it's not there. Corey's the younger, he's the male. Carrie is the younger, the female. And then Corinne is the mother. And I don't think you get the other names, but you might do, I don't know. It's not that memorable, in all honesty. And I've been waffling about it for probably long enough. But if I was to give some credit to Andrews, I would say that the way she deals with time is actually not bad. Like, she takes liberties to a certain extent. But what I found, like, once they got to the kind of year mark, the next part of the book, it already skipped another year. So I felt like that was quite well put together. To its, there aren't many things I would give it to its credit. The part about incest and all that, I would defend that section of it because these two, Kathy and Christopher, are put in a situation where they not only have to be parents to these very young infant twins, but they're in a vicinity that has entrapped them so much that their own sexual development is, of course, going to be distorted and perverted. And because of the grandmother's treatment of them as if they are already committing these types of sins, as she would put it, then it already, it's kind of like after a while, if you're accused of being a monster, then you can't exactly complain when monstrous things start occurring. So I actually thought it was downplayed, and that may have been due to their earlier upbringing when, things were good and that they knew it wasn't really right to do stuff like that. But of course, which I don't even know which one you'd sympathise more with, because Christopher being the eldest, he had to kind of, keep his head on his shoulders the most. And obviously his own hormones were probably going crazy around 15, 16. And then Kathy starts to catch up. But obviously there's this element where they still know that they can't really indulge in such a thing. And they don't want to, I don't think. It's more that it's just natural kind of desires. And because they were robbed of, basic human decency, it's not a fucking surprise that, incest was committed. I thought the way it was dealt with was more hilarious than anything else. I mean, it was like the descriptions of it, like his hot other sex and all this, and his flesh digging into my own, and all the language is just fucking hilarious. And yeah, the complete opposite of sexually arousing, I would say. It was more just preposterous and within its realm, I would say, of ridiculousness, where though I could go along with the believability of it, there were so many moments where it was just like, okay, how retarded are these kids? Because surely they should have been planning their escape from quite a bit earlier. So after a year, especially locked up with two young'uns, I think they would have realised that no one's coming to help them. Admittedly, maybe not. I don't know, because if they did trust their mother, like implicitly, they did genuinely believe that she loved them and would do anything for them, and was only doing this to make sure that their futures were secure. Blah blah blah. But it becomes more and more apparent that the mother is a bit of an empty shell of a person, really, and that she chooses to have possessions and material wealth over her own children, which is not really explained. I don't know whether there is a hint, like right at the end, which I will get to now. Fuck it, as I'm rambling on about this. Yeah, so they do plot their escape at some point. They manage to like do the typical thing of like making a copy of a key, which is a little bit convenient in the way they managed it. Then they, at some point, they realize as well that they're being poisoned by their own mother. And then that's the kind of the straw that breaks the camel's back as to them leaving. But due to a turn of events, what they plan on doing is like stealing their mother's money that she leaves lying around all the time, because she's very frivolous and doesn't really need to care about it because she's loaded. But yeah, a turn of events stops that from happening, so they have to kind of plan their escape with what they've got. I mean, the problem with it is, for me at least, is that everything goes very, very smoothly, like way too smoothly. Because although you're aware that there's many, many rooms to this mansion, many areas to explore, blah, 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 you don't really get to get a taste of that. You're at this point in the novel where they're planning their escape, and a paragraph later they're outside and they're going back over the tracks in which led them to the mansion. And you're like, the whole fucking novel has had them stuck in this room for 300 odd pages, 350 pages. And yet when it came to their escape, it was like, bang, out the door, easy, no problems whatsoever. And it's like, what the fuck is that? What an empty, like, shallow and superficial way to move it on. Unless, of course, you're more interested in getting into the next book, where you'll get the explanation and there will be a confrontation with the mother and all of this stuff. And I just thought that is so cheap and just, yeah, kind of like, it was everything I was fearing it would turn into towards the end. And yeah, that's about it for this one. I can't recommend it, but if you are looking for something a bit silly, a bit absurd, does have its occasional moments of horror, I'll give it that as well. Like, there are, yeah, some quite shocking turns of events, let's say, but nowhere near as much as it wants you to think it's got. And given the premise, the actual book is pretty empty, I would say. I did kind of enjoy the characters, like, to a certain extent, but yeah, the more I kind of looked into them, the more I'm like, okay, so the brother and sister have a kind of a relationship that I thought was quite endearing overall. Like, they clearly did love one another, not as lovers, but as brother and sister, but in a very unusual situation. And they took on their parental roles really well for their twins, their twin brother and sister. And that was all kind of fine. The mother just kind of gets forgotten and just gets, yeah. She disappears in the same fashion that the grandfather never appears, which may be typical of like getting sucked in. It seemed to be some kind of mild criticism over people with a lot of money and how they don't care about anything else. So there is a hint of that in the prose as well. So there's an air of cynicism to it, actually, in a lot of ways. But anything that I try to extrapolate as more meaningful feels a bit within the realm of falsity, to be honest, because I don't think it was striving for any higher meaning or anything like that. I think it's just a typical type of book that you could read within a week or so and just kind of like forget about, and that's it. I won't be reading any more. I have heard actually that VC Andrews was bedridden at some part of her life. I don't know whether she was paralyzed or whatever. And then after she died, the following books in the series were ghostwritten by a dude. So she's still tormenting us with pretty piss poor books from beyond the grave, which may be fitting. I don't know. Yeah, Flowers in the Attic. Can't recommend it, but if you want to laugh, I can. Yeah, that's one I'd point to. I'd probably say it's the worst book I've featured on book reviews for sure. I can't think of anything that I would ridicule as much as this. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.